The sound that only plays once. It began with a file that shouldn't have mattered, 7 seconds long, no title that meant anything, no creator anyone could trace, just a small, ordinary audio clip that appeared online without explanation. At first it was ignored, lost among the endless noise of the internet. But then, slowly, something changed. A few scattered users began posting about it. Not reviews, not theories, warnings. They all said the same thing: you can only hear it once. Naturally, more people tried it. They downloaded the file, pressed play, and for 7 seconds, they heard something. Something clear, something real. But when the audio ended and they tried again, there was nothing. No distortion, no glitch, just silence. The file hadn't changed. The waveform was still there. The duration was still exactly 7 seconds. But whatever had been inside it was gone. At first, people assumed it was a trick, some kind of psychological illusion or a cleverly designed piece of code that erased itself after being played. But analysis showed no hidden mechanisms, no triggers, no corruption. Technically, the sound should still exist, but it didn't. That's when the conversation shifted. Instead of asking why it stopped playing, people began asking something far more unsettling. What did you hear? The answers were different, but only on the surface. Some described a voice, not speaking but remembering, like hearing someone recall a moment that didn't belong to them. Others claimed they heard fragments of a memory, a place, a conversation, a feeling, something incomplete, something impossible. And yet, beneath all those variations, there was one detail that never changed. Everyone felt the same thing. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. As if for those 7 seconds they hadn't heard something new, but had remembered something they were never supposed to remember, something that didn't belong to their past or their life. And that was the part no one could explain. Because if the sound wasn't being heard, then maybe it wasn't a sound at all. The discovery. The file didn't spread like most things do online. There was no viral moment, no single post that pushed it into the spotlight. Instead, it moved quietly. A link dropped in a comment thread, a mention buried inside an obscure forum, a file shared between users who didn't know each other, but somehow found the same thing. At first glance, there was nothing special about it. A simple audio file, 7 seconds long, named playme.wave. No description, no context, just an unspoken invitation. And people, as they always do, clicked. The first reports were easy to ignore. Users claimed that after playing the file once, it stopped working, that it somehow used itself up. Most assumed it was a glitch, a corrupted upload, maybe even a poorly designed experiment. But then more people tried it. Different countries, different devices, different platforms. Same result, 7 seconds of sound, then silence. What made it stranger wasn't that it stopped playing, it was that nothing else changed. The file size remained identical. The waveform, when opened in editing software, looked untouched. No missing data, no visible gaps. It appeared completely normal. And yet, pressing play again produced nothing. No static, no distortion, not even a trace of the original sound. Just pure, uninterrupted silence. That's when curiosity turned into obsession. People began documenting everything. Screen recordings, audio captures, live reactions. Some even attempted to duplicate the file before playing it, creating backups in hopes of preserving whatever was inside. It didn't matter. Every copy behaved the same way. Once played, it was gone. Not deleted, not altered, just inaccessible. Audio engineers joined the conversation. They dissected the file down to its raw data, checked for hidden triggers, encrypted layers, embedded scripts, anything that could explain the behavior. There was nothing. No code, no anomaly, no mechanism that could cause a sound to exist once and then disappear without a trace. By every known standard, the file should have continued playing indefinitely. But reality didn't follow those rules. As the reports grew, a pattern began to form, not in the file itself, but in the people. Because when asked what they heard, no one described it the same way, yet no one described it as random either. There was structure, meaning, recognition. It didn't feel like noise. It didn't feel artificial. It felt specific, personal, as if the file wasn't broadcasting a sound, but delivering something tailored, something chosen. And that realization changed everything. Because if the audio wasn't the same for everyone, then the question was no longer, what is this sound? It became something far more unsettling. Why does it know what to play? The experiments. Once the pattern became undeniable, curiosity turned into something more deliberate. People stopped simply listening. They started testing. At first, the experiments were simple. Play the file on one device, then try again on another. A laptop, a phone, a tablet, different operating systems, different audio players. Same result. 7 seconds of sound the first time, silence every time after. Then they tried changing the conditions. Different headphones, high-end studio monitors, cheap earbuds, even external recording equipment routed through multiple layers of hardware. Nothing changed. The sound still vanished after the first listen, as if it wasn't tied to the device at all. So they pushed further. What if it was environmental? They played it in isolated rooms, in crowded spaces, at different times of day, morning, midnight, complete darkness, even inside soundproof studios. No variation. The file behaved exactly the same way. Predictable in outcome, impossible in explanation. Then came the more controlled experiments. Audio engineers imported the file into professional editing software, programs designed to manipulate sound at the most fundamental level. They examined the waveform frame by frame. It was all there. Every peak, every frequency, every detail intact. Nothing missing, nothing altered. They even attempted to bypass playback entirely, extracting the raw data and reconstructing the sound manually. Theoretically, it should have worked. But when they rendered the output, silence. As if whatever had existed inside those 7 seconds wasn't embedded in the data itself. As if it had never been recorded in a way machines could understand. That's when things started to feel wrong. Because the experiments weren't failing. They were succeeding, just not in the way anyone expected. Every test confirmed the same impossible conclusion. The file was normal, completely normal. And yet the experience of hearing it was not. So they changed their approach. If the sound couldn't be captured, maybe the listener could. Volunteers agreed to be monitored while playing the file. Heart rate sensors, brain activity scans, eye tracking, anything that might reveal what was happening during those 7 seconds. The results were inconsistent, but deeply unsettling. Heart rates would spike or drop suddenly. Brain activity showed unusual patterns, areas linked to memory and recognition lighting up far more than those associated with sound processing. It didn't look like people were just hearing something. It looked like they were remembering something. But that didn't make sense, because the descriptions people gave didn't match their real lives. They spoke of places they had never visited, conversations that never occurred, moments that didn't exist. And yet their brains reacted as if those experiences were real, as if they belonged. Then came the final experiment, the one that changed everything. A group attempted to record the sound externally during its first playback, using multiple independent devices, microphones placed around the room, direct audio capture from the source, backup systems running simultaneously. 7 seconds passed. Everyone in the room heard it, clearly. But when they checked the recordings, every device had captured the same thing. 7 seconds of silence, no distortion, no interference, just empty audio. That was the moment the theory shifted, because it meant one thing: the sound wasn't in the file. It wasn't in the speakers. It wasn't even in the air. Whatever people were hearing, it was happening somewhere else, somewhere that couldn't be recorded, somewhere that couldn't be replayed. And whatever that place was, it only opened once. The reactions. At first, people tried to describe what they heard. That seemed like the most logical step. If the sound couldn't be replayed, then maybe it could at least be understood through memory, through language. But almost immediately, that idea began to fall apart, because no one could describe it properly, not in a way that felt complete. They tried simple explanations first: a voice, a sound, a memory. But every time someone gave an answer, they would hesitate, like the word they chose wasn't quite right, like it only captured a fraction of what they experienced. So they tried going deeper. Some wrote long posts, breaking down every second of the audio as best as they could remember. They described tones, emotions, fragments of meaning. But even then, something was missing. Because the more they explained it, the less accurate it felt. It wasn't just difficult to describe, it was resistant to description. As if the moment they translated it into words, it stopped being what it originally was. Still, patterns began to emerge, not in the details, but in the feeling. One person described hearing their mother calling their name, except the voice was younger than it should have been. Another said they experienced a conversation with a friend they had never met, but somehow knew exactly what would be said next. Someone else claimed they saw a place, a vivid, detailed location, and felt certain they had been there before. They hadn't. None of them had, and yet none of them doubted it either. That was the unsettling part. There was no uncertainty in their reactions. No "I think" or "maybe." Only quiet conviction. It was real, not real as in heard clearly, real as in belonged to them. That's what connected every account. Not the content, but the recognition. People didn't react like they had discovered something new. They reacted like something had been returned to them, something forgotten, or perhaps something that had never been theirs to begin with. The emotional responses were just as consistent. Not fear, not panic, but something harder to define. A stillness, a pause. As if for those 7 seconds, everything else became irrelevant. Several people reported the same physical reaction. They stopped moving, completely. Not frozen by shock, but by focus. Like their mind had been pulled somewhere else. Somewhere internal, somewhere specific. A few described it afterward as being elsewhere. Not metaphorically, but literally. As if they had briefly existed inside a moment that wasn't part of their current reality. And when it ended, they returned. That idea should have sounded absurd. But no one laughed at it, because too many people described it the same way, independently, without influence, without coordination. Then came the recordings. Not of the sound, but of the people. Videos capturing their reactions in real time. In every clip, the pattern repeated. They would press play, listen, and then stillness. No dramatic reaction, no visible confusion, just a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, like something inside them had aligned or changed. And when it was over, they all did the same thing. They tried again, pressed play, waited, listened to nothing, and that's when the confusion appeared. Not about what they had heard, but about why it was gone. Because in that moment, something became clear. They hadn't imagined it. They hadn't misunderstood it. They had experienced something real, something precise, something that could not be repeated. And yet, they couldn't prove it. They couldn't share it. They couldn't even fully explain it. All they had left was the feeling, that strange, persistent sense of recognition. Like remembering a dream that fades the moment you wake up. Except this one didn't fade completely. It lingered, just enough to bother them, just enough to feel unfinished. And over time, a new kind of response began to appear. Not curiosity, not analysis, but something quieter, something more personal. People stopped asking what the sound was and started asking a different question. Why did it feel like it already belonged to me? The protagonist. He wasn't the first person to find the file, and he definitely wasn't the most qualified to understand it, but he was the one who decided not to let it go. At the time, he was a small content creator, someone who built his audience around strange, unexplained phenomena, internet mysteries, lost media, things that existed in the space between coincidence and impossibility. Most of his work followed the same pattern: find something unusual, break it down, explain it, or at least get close enough to feel satisfied. This was supposed to be another one of those cases. At first, he approached it like everyone else. He downloaded the file, read through the discussions, watched the reaction videos. He didn't believe it, not fully, because he had seen things like this before. Viral illusions, psychological tricks, elaborate hoaxes designed to exploit curiosity. And they always had an answer, eventually. So he decided to document it. Not just the file, but the people. He reached out to those who claimed to have heard it, conducted interviews, recorded conversations, asked the same question over and over again. What did you hear? At first, the responses intrigued him. Then they started to bother him. Not because they were strange, but because they were consistent in a way that didn't make sense. No two people described the same thing, and yet every description felt connected, like variations of something deeper, something shared. That contradiction stayed with him. So he went further. He began organizing the accounts, categorizing them, looking for patterns in tone, emotion, structure. He treated it like data. But the more he analyzed it, the less it behaved like data. There was no clear pattern, no repeatable structure, only fragments, pieces that refused to align into anything logical. And yet when he stepped back and looked at them as a whole, they felt unified. That was the first moment he hesitated, not because he was scared, but because for the first time, he couldn't reduce something into an explanation. Still, he kept going, because that's what he always did. He set up recordings, high-quality audio, multiple cameras, controlled environment. There was something happening during those 7 seconds. He wanted to capture it. Not the sound, the reaction. He invited participants, people who had never heard the file before. He explained the rules. You will hear it once, and then you won't. Most of them smiled when he said that. They didn't believe it either. Not yet. He filmed everything. The anticipation, the curiosity, the exact moment they pressed play, and then the silence afterward. He watched the footage over and over again, frame by frame, looking for something, anything. A change in expression, a micro-reaction, a sign that something real had happened. And every time he saw it, that same shift, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable, like a thought passing through someone's mind that didn't belong there before. That's when it stopped being just content, because he realized something important. He wasn't documenting a phenomenon, he was documenting an experience. And experiences don't behave the way data does. They don't repeat cleanly, they don't align perfectly. They exist in the space between perception and memory. And this one felt too precise to be random. Still, there was one step left, the obvious one, the step he had been avoiding. He hadn't listened to it yet, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want to compromise the observation. If he experienced it himself, he would no longer be objective. He would become part of it. And once that happened, there would be no going back. But eventually, the question became unavoidable. How do you analyze something you refuse to experience? So he prepared, carefully. He set up the recording equipment again, multiple angles, clean audio capture, everything calibrated. If something happened, he wanted proof. Not just for others, for himself. He sat down, headphones on, the file open in front of him. 7 seconds, that's all it was. 7 seconds that had already affected thousands of people. 7 seconds that no one could explain. For a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because up until this point, the phenomenon had been external, something he could study, something he could control. But the moment he pressed play, that would change. He would no longer be the observer, he would be the subject. And whatever this thing was, it would finally reach him. He hovered over the button, took a breath, and then he clicked. The first listen. The moment he pressed play, nothing felt unusual. No immediate distortion, no sudden shift in the room, no sign that anything extraordinary had begun. Just sound. For the first second, it registered exactly the way any normal audio would. His brain processed it as something external, something coming through the headphones, something separate from him. But that separation didn't last. By the second second, something changed. Not in the sound itself, but in how he experienced it. It stopped feeling like he was hearing something and started feeling like he was recognizing it. His body didn't react at first. No tension, no fear, just a subtle stillness. The kind that happens when your attention is pulled inward, away from everything else. By the third second, the room around him began to lose clarity. Not visually, but mentally. The awareness of where he was, of the desk, the equipment, the recording setup, started to fade into the background. It wasn't disappearing. It was becoming irrelevant. Because something else was taking priority, something internal, something specific. The sound, or whatever it was no longer behaving like audio. It had structure, but not in a way he could isolate into frequencies or patterns. It felt more like a sequence, a progression, like moving through something instead of simply listening to it. By the fourth second, he wasn't in control of the experience anymore. Not in the way he expected. He wasn't deciding what to focus on. The focus was being chosen for him, and what it chose didn't belong to him. At least that was his first instinct, because what he perceived next wasn't a sound. It was a moment, not a vague impression, a fully formed fragment of experience. He wasn't sitting at his desk, he was somewhere else, not physically, but completely. There was a sense of place, clear, defined, undeniable. Not just an image, but a presence, a location that carried weight, context, familiarity, and yet he had never been there, or at least he shouldn't have. There was no memory of arriving, no explanation for why it felt so real, but the certainty was immediate. This wasn't imagination. It didn't feel constructed. It felt recalled. By the fifth second, the feeling intensified, because the moment didn't stay static, it moved, not like a video playing back, but like something unfolding in real time. There were details, textures, a sense of time passing within those seconds, even though he knew somewhere in the back of his mind that only a few seconds were actually passing in reality. And then there was recognition, not gradual, not uncertain, immediate. A sudden, overwhelming certainty that he knew this moment, not as something new, but as something remembered. That realization didn't bring comfort. It brought confusion, because there was no reference point, no past event to connect it to, no explanation for how something so detailed, so specific, could feel so familiar without ever existing in his life. By the sixth second, something shifted again. The perspective changed, not dramatically, but enough to break the illusion of passive observation. He wasn't just experiencing the moment, he was part of it, not watching, participating. There was an awareness, subtle but undeniable, that whatever this was, it included him. Not the version of him sitting at the desk, but a version of him that belonged there, inside that moment, inside that place. And that was when the first trace of discomfort appeared, because the feeling wasn't just familiarity anymore, it was ownership. As if this memory, this impossible, unexplainable fragment wasn't something he recognized, but something that belonged to him, something that always had. And yet, he had no memory of ever living it. Then came the seventh second, and everything stopped. Not gradually, not fading out, just cut. He was back, sitting in the chair, headphones still on, the room exactly as it had been, the equipment still recording. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed, except him. For a few seconds, he didn't react. Not because he didn't understand what had happened, but because he couldn't process it. His mind tried to categorize it: sound, memory, imagination, illusion. None of them fit, because none of them explained the most important part. It had felt real. Not real in the sense of clarity or detail, but real in the sense of belonging. Like something that had always existed within him, just out of reach until that moment. He slowly removed the headphones. His hands were steady, his breathing normal. There was no panic, no immediate fear, just a quiet, persistent awareness that something was wrong, not externally, internally. Because as he sat there trying to recall exactly what he had experienced, it began to slip. Not completely, but enough to notice. The details blurred, the structure faded, the clarity dissolved, but the feeling remained, that same recognition, that same certainty, that same impossible sense that what he had just experienced was not new. He looked at the screen. The file was still there, unchanged. 7 seconds, ready to be played again. He knew what should happen next. He had seen it dozens of times. Everyone else had tried and failed. The second playback was always silent. That was the rule. That was the pattern. That was the one consistent truth in all of this. He reached for the mouse, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Because there was one question he couldn't ignore. Had he just heard something? Or had something inside him been accessed? He hovered over the play button again. This time there was hesitation, not fear, something deeper. Because if the sound was gone, then the experience was over. But if it wasn't, then whatever this was, it hadn't finished with him yet. And that possibility felt far more unsettling than silence. The second play. He already knew what was supposed to happen. He had seen it too many times. The second attempt would fail, no matter the device, no matter the person, no matter the conditions. Silence, that was the pattern. That was the only consistent rule in everything they had discovered. So when he moved the cursor back over the file, there was no real expectation, only confirmation, a final step to complete the process, to prove that what he experienced had been a one-time event, contained, isolated, finished. He clicked. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, sound, clear, present, impossible. He froze, not because of what he was hearing, but because he was hearing anything at all. That alone broke everything. Every test, every report, every conclusion that had been built around the file collapsed in an instant, because the rule had been absolute. No one hears it twice, except now he was. The first second passed differently this time. There was no gradual transition, no shift from external sound to internal recognition. It began already inside, as if whatever barrier had existed before was gone. The sound didn't feel like it was coming through the headphones anymore. It felt like it was already there, waiting. By the second he realized something else. This wasn't the same, not even close. Whatever he had experienced the first time, this was not a repeat. There were no familiar tones, no recognizable structure, no sense of returning to the same moment. It was new, completely new, and yet it carried the same weight, the same strange sense of significance. By the third second, the environment around him faded again. But this time, it happened faster, more efficiently, like the process had been learned, optimized. He didn't feel like he was being pulled into something. He felt like he was falling into a place that was already open. The transition was smoother, more direct, and whatever he entered this time was clearer, more stable, more detailed. It wasn't just a fragment, it was a sequence, a continuous experience unfolding with intention. And again, that recognition. Stronger now, more immediate, but also more confusing, because this moment, like the last, felt familiar, deeply familiar, but in a different way. Not like recalling the same memory, more like recalling something from the same source. The same origin point, different content, same connection. By the fourth second, a pattern began to form in his mind. Not in the sound, but in the structure of the experience. Each second wasn't delivering audio, it was delivering access to something internal, something layered, something that existed beyond his conscious awareness. And the more he focused on it, the more it responded. That realization unsettled him, because it implied interaction, not passive listening. Not random playback, but something responsive, something that adjusted. By the fifth second, the boundary between observer and participant collapsed completely. There was no distance anymore, no separation. He wasn't experiencing the moment, he was inside it, fully, completely. And once again, there was that presence, that version of himself that belonged there, except this time, it felt closer, more aligned, less foreign, as if the gap between who he was and whatever this was shrinking. That's when the thought appeared, uninvited, unclear in origin, but undeniable in meaning. This isn't changing randomly, it's changing for you. The moment that thought formed, the experience deepened, not visually, not structurally, but conceptually. It felt like something had acknowledged the realization, as if understanding it allowed it to go further. By the sixth second, the discomfort returned, stronger than before, because now there was a question he couldn't ignore. If this wasn't the same sound, and if it was changing based on him, then what exactly had he heard the first time? And more importantly, how many versions of this existed? The idea didn't feel theoretical. It felt real, immediate, like standing in front of something vast and only seeing a small part of it, and knowing instinctively that there was more, far more. Then came the seventh second, and once again, everything stopped. He was back, the room, the desk, the equipment, unchanged, silent. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. He didn't move right away. His hand remained on the mouse, his eyes fixed on the screen, because now the rule was broken completely. Not just once, but fundamentally. The file wasn't single use. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't even consistent. It was variable, adaptive, and somehow connected to him. He replayed the moment in his mind, the first listen, the second, comparing them, looking for overlap. There was none. Not in content, not in structure, only in feeling. That same impossible recognition, that same sense of belonging to something he couldn't place. But now there was something else layered on top of it. Expectation. Because if it had changed once, it could change again. He looked at the file. Still there, still 7 seconds, still silent on the surface, but no longer predictable, no longer understood. His finger hovered over the mouse again. And this time, the hesitation was real. Because the question had changed. It was no longer, will it play? Now it was, What will it show me next? And beneath that, a deeper question, one he didn't want to ask. How many times can I do this before whatever it's giving me stops feeling like something I don't recognize and starts feeling like something I'm becoming? Second phase. After the second playback, everything changed. Not just the phenomenon, him. At first, he told himself it was still manageable, still observable, just a variation of the same anomaly, something rare but not entirely beyond understanding. That belief didn't last, because the moment he stepped away from the recording setup, something followed him, not physically, but perceptually. The room felt the same. The objects were exactly where they had been. Nothing had moved, nothing had altered. And yet, there was a subtle shift in how everything felt, as if the world had lost a layer of certainty. He tried to ignore it, focused on reviewing the footage instead, frame by frame just like before, looking for evidence, looking for anything that could anchor what he experienced back into something objective. But the recordings showed nothing unusual, no distortion, no anomalies, no visible change in his behavior beyond the same stillness everyone else had shown. 7 seconds. Silence on playback. Perfectly normal. Except now he knew that wasn't true. Because while the recording showed nothing, his memory did. Or at least something that felt like memory. That was when the second phase truly began. Not with the file, but with what came after. At first, it was small, easy to dismiss. Moments where his attention drifted, just slightly, and something unfamiliar would surface. A place, a fragment, a sensation. Not vivid enough to fully form, but strong enough to feel present. He would catch himself pausing, trying to recall where it came from. There was no answer, only that same quiet recognition, like something just out of reach, something that almost made sense. Then it started happening more often. Not randomly, but triggered. He noticed it first when he heard certain sounds, not specific ones, just patterns, rhythms, frequencies. They didn't recreate the experience, but they echoed it, like fragments of something larger. And each time it happened, the same thing followed, a brief shift, a flicker of something that didn't belong to his current reality. At first, he thought it was memory distortion, his brain trying to reconstruct what it had experienced, filling in gaps, creating false continuity. But that theory collapsed quickly, because these moments weren't reconstructing the past. They were introducing something new, new details, new sequences, new memories that had never appeared during the original playback. And yet, they carried the same signature, that same impossible familiarity, that same sense that they belonged to him. That's when the pattern became undeniable. The file hadn't just given him an experience, it had opened something. And now it wasn't closing. He tried to stop. For a full day he avoided the file, didn't play it again, didn't even look at it. He wanted to see if the effects would fade. If whatever this was had limits, it didn't. If anything, the absence made it worse. Because now, without the controlled environment of those 7 seconds, the fragments came unpredictably, unstructured, bleeding into his normal perception, a moment while walking, a pause mid-conversation, a sudden sense of being somewhere else, overlapping with where he actually was. Brief, but undeniable. And each time it happened, the line between memory and experience blurred a little more. That's when he made a decision, not out of curiosity, but out of control. If this thing was going to continue, he needed to understand it, not from a distance, but directly. So he went back, sat down, opened the file. Again, this time, there was no hesitation, because the fear had shifted. It wasn't about what he would hear. It was about what would happen if he didn't. He pressed play, and once again, the world gave way. But this time, it didn't feel like entering something new. It felt like returning, not to the same place, but to the same system, the same underlying structure. And now he could feel it more clearly. This wasn't a sound. It wasn't even a series of experiences. It was a process, something iterative, layered. Each playback wasn't repeating. It was building, expanding, like moving deeper into something that had no visible end. And with each layer, the experiences became more coherent, more connected, less like fragments, more like a continuous reality forming piece by piece. That was the realization that changed everything. This wasn't random. It wasn't infinite. It was directional. And wherever it was leading, he was already on the path, Whether he chose to continue or not no longer mattered. The realization. At some point, he stopped asking what the sound was, because the question no longer made sense. It assumed there was something external to identify, something contained within the file, something that could be isolated, defined, explained. But everything he had experienced pointed in the opposite direction. The file wasn't the source, it was the trigger. The realization didn't come all at once. It formed slowly, piece by piece, across multiple listens, across the fragments that followed, across the subtle shifts in his perception that he could no longer ignore. At first, he tried to map it logically. Each playback delivered a different experience. Each experience felt personal. Each one carried that same underlying sense of recognition. But they weren't random. They weren't disconnected. They shared structure, continuity, progression. That's what he hadn't noticed at the beginning. The first time, it felt like a single moment. The second time, a different one. But by the third, the fourth, the fifth, he began to see it. These weren't separate fragments. They were connected, not linearly, but fundamentally, like different entries into the same system, the same space, the same reality. That was the word that finally settled in his mind. Not memory, not hallucination, reality. Not the one he was physically in, but one that existed with its own consistency, its own continuity, its own internal logic. And every time he played the file, he accessed it. Not a recording of it, not a representation, the thing itself. That idea should have been impossible, but it explained everything. Why the sound couldn't be recorded, why it couldn't be replayed by others, why each person experienced something different, because it was never about the sound, it was about the connection. Each listener accessed something unique, something tailored, a single entry point, and then it closed, locked, finished. For everyone else, one time was enough, because whatever system this was, it only allowed a single connection per person, a single key. But for him, that rule didn't apply. At first, he thought he was an exception, a glitch. Something had gone wrong in the process. But the more he experienced it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. Because unlike the others, his experiences weren't isolated. They built on each other. Each playback added something, a new perspective, a new sequence, a new layer of coherence. And over time, those layers began to align. What once felt like disconnected moments now formed something continuous, something structured, something that resembled a life. Not his life, but a life. One that he was slowly beginning to understand. That was when the final piece fell into place. The reason it felt familiar, the reason every experience carried that same sense of recognition. It wasn't because he had lived those moments before. It was because he was living them now. Just not all at once, not in sequence, but across iterations. Each playback wasn't showing him something from the past. It was placing him into a timeline, fragment by fragment, and his mind, trying to reconcile those pieces, interpreted them as memory, because that was the closest framework it had. But it wasn't memory, it was accumulation. That realization changed the question completely. This wasn't, what did I hear? Or even, what is this sound? It became something far more unsettling. If each time I listen, I experience another part of this, then what happens when I reach the end? Because if there was an end, then there was a whole, a complete version of whatever this reality was. And if he experienced all of it, if every fragment aligned into something continuous, then there would be no difference left between what he had lived and what he had only accessed. No boundary, no separation, just a single unified experience. And the thought that followed that realization was the one he couldn't ignore. If that happens, which life is real? The final twist. At first, he thought he was moving through something, a hidden layer of reality, a system revealing itself piece by piece, a sequence waiting to be completed. But that assumption, like all the others, was wrong. The realization didn't come during a playback. It came in the silence between them, in the moments where he wasn't listening, but something still felt active. At some point, he stopped noticing when one experience ended and another began. Not because they blended together, but because the boundary between them disappeared. He would be sitting in his room, And suddenly, without pressing play, without any sound at all, he would know something. A detail, a place, a moment. Not recalled, not imagined, just present. As if it had always been there. That's when the final pattern revealed itself. The file was never delivering new experiences. It was removing the barrier that prevented him from accessing them. Each playback didn't add something. It unlocked something, something that already existed inside him, or perhaps around him. The distinction was no longer clear, because the more he listened, the less dependent the process became on the file itself. At first, he needed the 7 seconds, then only the intention, and eventually nothing at all. The experiences continued, unprompted, uncontrolled, and more importantly, unchanged. They stopped feeling like fragments, stopped feeling like pieces of something incomplete. They stabilized, aligned, became consistent, like a reality that no longer needed to be assembled because it was already whole. That's when the most disturbing realization emerged. There were no more variations, no more new versions, no more branching possibilities. Everything he experienced from that point on matched perfectly. The same places, the same sequences, the same sense of continuity. Not repeating, but persisting. Like he had reached the end of the process, or worse, the beginning. Because if nothing new was being revealed anymore, then it meant one thing. He wasn't discovering this reality anymore. He was inside it, fully, completely. And the life he had been living, the room, the recordings, the file, those weren't the stable elements. They were the fragments, the temporary layer, the entry point, the illusion of origin. He tried to stop listening, tried to disconnect, but there was nothing left to stop. The sound no longer mattered. The file no longer mattered, because whatever it had started had already finished. And the final proof came in the simplest way possible. He opened the file one last time. 7 seconds. He pressed play. And this time, he heard nothing. Not because it stopped working, but because there was nothing left to access. No new layer, no hidden sequence, no remaining fragment, just silence, complete, absolute. And for the first time, it felt correct. Because the process was never about hearing something once or even multiple times. It was about reaching a point where there was nothing left to hear, because everything had already been experienced, already been integrated, already been lived. And in that moment, one final thought settled in his mind, clear, unavoidable. If the sound was never meant to be replayed, then maybe neither was he. Closing question. So now there's only one question left. Not about the file, not about the sound, about you. If a 7-second audio clip could make people remember something they never lived, if it could open something that feels more real than reality itself, then what exactly is it accessing? Is it creating something new or revealing something that was always there? And if one person was able to hear it more than once, if they didn't just experience it, but became part of it, then what does that mean for everyone else? Did they only hear the beginning, or were they stopped before they could go further? Because maybe the sound doesn't disappear after the first listen. Maybe it just decides that you've heard enough. But if you had the chance to hear it again, would you? And more importantly, if the next time you press play, it doesn't feel like listening, but like continuing something you never finished, would you still want to know how it ends?
Shadows crawl